Hi, welcome to week 5. I think it's a Mac. I'm biting into this apple to remind myself that one of the oldest stories we have on record is a story that has come down to us known as the temptation and fall of Adam and Eve. And it had to do with a particular kind of fruit, whether it was an apple or something exotic like a pomegranate, who knows. But in that story, remember, Eve is tempted by the serpent. And then Adam eats the apple. Whoops, there I go. Adam eats that fruit. And when he's asked why he did it, because he was not supposed to, what did Adam do? He said, "She told me to do it. She gave it to me. And I ate it." Adam passed the buck. One of the oldest stories we have in the history of humankind is about buck passing, of failing to own up to our own personal responsibility. In many ways, the story of Adam and Eve, which, by the way, comes to us from the one I'm talking about from the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew Testament, Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, Torah, that part of the Tanakh, Torah, the Christian Old Testament. But it's about failing to be authentic, to own up to our individual choices. And that's what we're doing in week 6. We're talking about existentialism, which is the quest for the authentic life, the search for being that really is being, that has integrity. It's an interesting following from what we've done last week when we were talking about virtue and character. In fact, Nina Rosenstand begins this chapter about the authentic life with the idea of role modeling and mentoring. Do we have folks that are out there in front of us who are leading the way that we emulate because there's something in them of character that speaks to us in the growth of our own characters? And there's something about the person that we emulate, the role model that we choose to follow, that is in their character that we wish to embody because it just seems right. I have a discussion question up for you about that, about role models and the authentic life. And I think it's an interesting question. So make sure you look at that. And there's a great clip too, by the way. Christina Hoff Sommers is interviewed by John Stewart on The Daily Show. And it's a fun interview. But she raises some really important questions about how we're raising children today and whether we have gone a bit too far. And that's the other discussion question for this week. In addition to this, there's a writing assignment. I'm going to ask you to read a story, a fable, by Edwin Friedman called The Bridge. Now, Friedman ultimately is a psychologist who works in the area of systems theory, which is a kind of psychological process where we look at the relationships, the network of relationships that we have between and among persons, and see and tease out of those relationships findings and ways of being that can enable or disable us, so to speak. And it's in that exploring of relationships where we find maybe some things we did not know otherwise. But nevertheless, he has a whole book of fables, and one of the fables that he has written is called The Bridge. And I'm going to ask you to finish the story. I've left off the last few paragraphs of his original story, and I want you to write the conclusion based on what you think and how you think it ought to end, since we're kind of in a story mode this semester when it comes to ethics. And then I've provided for you the real story or the real ending that Friedman has for us. So that should be a good exercise for you. But anyway, now we're talking about existentialism, and I want to say quickly that existentialism really, as I teach it especially in my face-to-face courses at Robert Morris University, is really posing two different sides to it. There is the theological side to existentialism, where we posit that there is a God who was very actively involved in our lives in order to lead us and to show us authentic being. And by subscribing to the ethical demands that God places upon us, and as we achieve and reach for those, ultimately, in the terms of one of its exponents, Soren Kierkegaard, take a leap of faith, we embrace the fullness, the trueness of being as we reach out to embrace God and God's call to us. And so there is a theological existentialism. But there's also this non-theological, or in some cases, atheistic, not God, no God, existentialism, in which we are back to ourselves. We are thrust back into who we are and what we are in our own skin, and the choices that were ultimately ours to make. Jean-Paul Sartre said, if God does not exist, all things are possible. And that's a kind of a scary notion in that sense, but for him, I think it means that ultimately he is put on notice, and he is responsible in ways that he might not feel otherwise. Jean-Paul Sartre, again, the one who would maybe best represent the non-theological or atheistic existential position. He's a person who had a very interesting and dramatic history. Remember, he lived through a number of world wars. He was a French resistance fighter against the Nazis in World War II. And he has been through the mill of very difficult, dramatic circumstances where life was always being challenged day by day by day. And so for him, he had to own the choices that he made. Kierkegaard himself was surrounded in a theological culture in Denmark where he lived in the 1800s. And he felt that there were times when there was just so much religious talk out there in the air. He said, there is no lack of information in a Christian land, but the one person does not know what the other person is saying. In other words, there's so much talk, it's like, where is reality? And so Kierkegaard, very much a Christian, very much a theologian, grounded in the quest for meaning, especially as it relates to God and as he relates to God, he is seeking really that true being. Where's the real story in all this? Yet he's doing it, again, from a position of theological integrity. Now, move it forward 100 years, and here we have Jean-Paul Sartre after the Second World War, where we have been through this enormous struggle, this extreme violence, this terror of warring nations. And he says, you know what? I think it's up to me. And there are others like him who are there as well. And so the search for ultimate meaning, for authenticity, for the ability to stand on one's own 2 feet and claim the ground upon which we stand, ultimately is a form of angst. Kierkegaard called it dread. And it is a tough place to be in that position where you have to choose. But the existentialist says you have to choose. Interestingly enough, the atheist Jean-Paul Sartre said, to do anything less is bad faith. Curious. And yet what he meant by that is, our inability to choose, or our unwillingness to choose, or our instead of just being one with the crowd, getting lost in the crowd, is an inauthentic life. It is to fail to truly be. And for Kierkegaard, same thing. Ultimately, it comes down to a point beyond which I must take a leap of faith. And that leap of faith may run counter to what the prevailing ethical standard is. Kierkegaard talks about 3 levels of authenticity. There's the initial level where the aesthetic, where we kind of live out our pleasures and try to just simply satisfy ourselves. It's a very childlike level. We move then into the ethical stage, where we are responding to the urgencies and the exigencies of life, where we have to follow the law, for instance, and pay our taxes and do all those kinds of things. But ultimately, there comes that point where we have to go beyond sometimes where we otherwise would be, the norm, in order to be at that religious stage. And that is the leap of faith. In any case, whether you approach existentialism, the search for ultimate being, from a theological perspective or from a non-theological perspective, it is ultimately taking responsibility, not passing the buck. Not passing the buck, but choosing and living into the fullness of the choice you make, come what may. I want to look at my notes here to make sure I've got everything that I've wanted to say. You have an exam this week. It's I think it's on chapters 8 and 9, where actually the existential material, I think, is chapter 10. They say that death is the final exam. Well, remember that in ethics, introduction to ethics here, the final exam is actually a paper. And it's that original question I posed to you: how then shall I live? And it's your thoughtful reflection, given all the things we've been learning over these weeks, integrating 1 or 2 of those theoretical positions and 1 or 2 of those theorists into your own life story, in which you answer that question. Now, I need to have that paper in my hands, I should say, in the box, in the Blackboard shell, no later than Sunday, before the start of week 8. I know that's a push, but here's the point. This course ends on the 17th. I have grades due the next day. I have to have time to grade your papers. So I need you to get those papers into me at the end of week 7, so that I have time sufficient in order to grade and process the grades for the semester. So please, please make sure you do that. Now, what else? Just a couple other things to take note of. Jean-Paul Sartre, you will see him show up again next week, but through the mouth and thinking of his significant other. Her name was Simone de Beauvoir, and she was a second-wave feminist, and we'll be talking about gender ethics next week. And both she and Jean-Paul Sartre believed that the search for authenticity was, in a sense, gender neutral, because we have to be about finding our true selves, whether we're male or female. And the 2 of them had a lot to say about that. We'll be hearing primarily Jean-Paul Sartre's voice this week, but Simone de Beauvoir's voice next week. So be open and aware of that. We'll also revisit Christina Hoff Sommers. She has some interesting things to say about gender ethics. A different note than Simone de Beauvoir. So stay tuned to that. I want to make sure I've got everything that I've wanted to say here. Yeah, okay. So here we are on the quest for authenticity. Oh, by the way, there's a clip that goes along with the bridge, I think, that I put in from Dead Poets Society. It's a scene in that wonderful movie where the Latin term carpe diem is given voice. Carpe diem, seize the day. And that is a very authentic thing to do. By the way, if you ever encounter anybody who says, I'm an existentialist, hey, I'm an existentialist, and then you ask them about a certain thing, they say, whatever, they're not existentialists. No worthy existentialist would ever say, whatever. No. It is always about choosing authentically and questing for true being. It's never a giveaway. Ever. Ever. So, welcome to week 6. The search for authenticity. Enjoy. Whoops. Maybe I should say, be real.